in my last tour, I filed a 5-page discrimination complaint against that CO that was abusing me. And when I asked him, I said, I want to know why this is happening to me. I said, I've been a team player everywhere I've served, and I have never had these kind of problems. I want to know why this is happening to me. And I had gotten quite emotional because it was, it had been going on for like 9 months. And he looked at me with a smirk and he said, well, do you feel like a second-class citizen? So in other words, he's telling me, I'm doing this to you because you're Black and I can do it and nothing's going to happen.
Welcome to Your Story Doesn't End Here, the mental health podcast of military and veterans who refuse to be silenced. I'm your host, Rachel, and my mission with this podcast is to be a voice for those who don't have a voice, bring awareness to mental health issues, provide value and solutions, and to change the culture when it comes to mental health within the DoD organizations. Listen up, this message is for all of my listeners located in Washington State, specifically Whidbey Island. Your Story Doesn't End Here will be hosting our very first Bring a Buddy event that will be taking place at Whidbey Coffee, located at the SR20 location in Oak Harbor, Washington, on December 11th from 3 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. The concept is simple. You can bring your buddy, have a conversation over a cup of coffee, and everyone that brings a buddy gets entered into a raffle for a gift card to Whidbey Coffee. Our intention is to show just how easy it can be to have a mental health conversation and to normalize these types of conversations surrounding mental health. Simultaneously, we will be raising money for the Headstrong Project, and details about this nonprofit, as well as options to donate ahead of time, will be in the show notes. We are so excited for this first event, and we hope to see you there. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming back for another episode this week of Your Story Doesn't End Here. Today, I have the honor of introducing our guest, Reuben Keith Green. He is a retired naval officer who served from 1975 to 1997. He is committed to making service better for service members and veterans. Author of Black Officer, White Navy, and several published articles. He lives in Jacksonville, Florida currently. Keith, I am so excited to have you on the show today to share your story. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for the invite, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Well, I would love to just get into your story. I've heard little bits and pieces from what you've told me, and I am just so intrigued to hear your experience and for the listeners to hear as well, especially from someone that served back in the 70s. You know, we don't get a lot of guests from back then that served. So, floor is yours, Keith.
Well, great. And thank you again for having me. I joined the Navy in 1975 as a high school dropout. My bosun mate father refused to sign the papers for me to join the Navy because he told me the Navy was too racist and I'm not signing the papers for you to join. And I'm 17 years old and I'm thinking, that was a long time ago, a couple of years, and Admiral Zumwalt, the CNO, fixed all that. So I'm going to trust Zumwalt instead of my own father. It didn't take me very long to figure out that my father knew a lot more about what he was talking about than I realized. But I joined the Navy out of Tarpon Springs, Florida, a little fishing village, a Greek fishing village on the Gulf of Mexico, right above Clearwater, Dunedin area, and went to Miami A School in Charleston, South Carolina. And I began to start experiencing issues with anxiety starting in A School, because we had 25 or 26 students going through Miami A School class in Charleston, South Carolina. I was the only Black student and I was the youngest person in the class. And it was apparent that I was being targeted for removal because they would not acknowledge any of my outstanding uniform appearances. I was doing extremely well in academics, but when I had to do some sort of practical, I would get the lowest grade in the class for the most part. So I'm getting A's in my academic work. When I had to explain something to one of the instructors, all of a sudden I got very stupid. So that began to mess with my head. The guys that I would help through their practicals were getting A's and I was getting C's, and I had to teach them how to present themselves. So by the time I graduated A School, I qualified for accelerated advancement and honor roll. Well, they changed my grade from a 3.61 to a 3.57, sending me a message. And they also had a board for accelerated advancement, and I passed the board, but they told me I wasn't eligible after I'd passed the board because I was a reservist, which turned out to be a lie. So my career began with issues of trust and anxiety because I couldn't understand why I was being treated differently than all the other students. And it took a while for me to figure out that it was because I was Black. And I began to experience over many years, 22 years, overlapping patterns of behavior that eventually increased to the point where I was diagnosed with anxiety and depression by a mental health specialist in my last year of service when I was battling an openly racist commanding officer and his ISIC, who also, well, I'll get to that later. But I just want to say the reason I'm speaking out now is because I was silent for 20 years after I retired on April Fool's Day in 1997. And I spent 20 years with untreated, diagnosed anxiety and depression, and all the while trying to make sense of what had happened to me. Because I had been a top performing officer. I qualified as a steam and a gas turbine engineer officer of the watch as a very young, almost a frock lieutenant. So I was a hot running guy. And it all depended who I worked on, what my environment, what my tour was going to be like. I had one skipper from Texas that I gave 150%, and he dinged me on the way out the door, which also had an impact on my mental health. So I guess I'll start from what I do now. And what I do now is I'm calling out the military on how they handle complaints of discrimination and how they handle toxic leadership, because this is having long-term effects on people. I've been working with an attorney who was a prosecutor who's working to show the difficulty that minorities have in documenting the racial discrimination that they have faced when they go to file a claim with the VA, because nobody puts that in your service record. No one puts PTSD in your service record. So what people are fighting is getting compensation for what they endured, and the system is designed so that you can't document it. If you file a complaint, that information doesn't make it into the service record. You can't file. There is no, I wrote an article a few months ago about making racism a UCMJ offense, racist behavior a UCMJ offense. That would help people document a paper trail of what they experienced. And if there's a person who is consistently over the course of a career discriminating and never being held accountable, number one, that person is never held accountable. And number two, there's no paper trail of the lives that he's damaged over the long term. So that's one of my goals. And the other is to try to eliminate the psychological abuse that has been exhibited against minority service members for 25 years since Ronald Reagan named a aircraft carrier after Mississippi Senator John C. Stennis, who's an avowed segregationist, lifelong racist, and went out of his way to make it difficult for the civil rights movement to succeed. He was against the Martin Luther King holiday. He was against integration. He did a lot to undermine the military's efforts to improve race relations. When riots broke out in the Vietnam War arena, the Army realized that the services were tearing themselves apart, so they banned the Confederate flag in theater. They also had cross burnings and KKK rallies and et cetera. But Mississippi Senator John C. Stennis was one of the individuals that made the Army reverse course. So you had people serving in Vietnam having to walk out of their hooches or their huts and see a cross burning in front of their house when they got up in the morning or at night. So that psychological impact had a lifelong intergenerational impact on my minority Vietnam era service veterans. I was in boot camp in March of '75 when Saigon fell. So I saw that from that perspective, but I'm a Vietnam era veteran, but I don't claim to be a Vietnam veteran because I'm not. So what I do now is I'm trying to push to get the military and the Department of Defense to, number one, acknowledge that racism is a bigger problem than they're willing to admit. One of the things that happened after I wrote my book, and I did a lot of research before I started writing. I wrote a whole book and then I threw it out and started over again because I decided rather than do this academic stuff, I'm just going to tell the raw story. I don't care who I piss off. I don't care who gets angry. These are the facts and the truth. And if anybody wants to come after me for telling the truth, here I am. Let's have the battle. But one of the things that happened after I wrote my book I included a lot of information specifically for the Navy from the annual defense reports. Those annual defense reports, appendices, had segments, and one of them was formal discrimination complaints filed across DOD. And you could go to the archives of the annual defense reports on the internet, and you could pull it up for all the services. And I just pulled the stuff out of the Navy. I downloaded every single one of them. But for several years, starting in '87 through the mid '90s, I just showed what the number of complaints that were filed, the number that were substantiated, and the number that were not substantiated. Because I wanted people to see, if you're facing this issue and this problem, and you file a complaint, what are the odds of you being successful with that complaint? Less than a year after my book came out, and I said in my book, you don't have to take my word for it. You can go look for yourself. The Department of Defense stripped all that information off of the internet. You cannot find it anywhere. I filed a FOIA request for the information that I did not have, and the Air Force gave me 350 pages, 10 years worth of data. The Navy and the Coast Guard completely ignored my request. They gave me nothing. So if the systems that are designed to help you navigate the system of discrimination and toxic leadership and racism aren't willing to disclose what happens if you try, then that says that they are ashamed of their own system.
So Keith, what did you find when you found these records of complaints versus what was considered substantiated? What was the trend in this data?
Well, it's fascinating. There's a fascinating story there, because this data came about because Congressman Ron Dellums from California did a tour of military bases in the late '90s, and he was getting so many complaints from minority service members about how they were being treated, and racism and discrimination, and how it was impacting their mental health and their psychological well-being, that he did a tour of military bases, and he was on the Armed Services Committee. So after he did that tour, and you can pull up the document where they reported to him what they were doing in 1997 to address his concerns. So what he did was require that they report to Congress every year on an annual basis the number of formal complaints submitted, the number substantiated, and the number not substantiated, starting in 1987. Now, I got commissioned. I joined in '75. I got commissioned in '84. And in 1988, I did one tour as a division officer on a steam frigate, qualified as a steam EAL on a frigate while I was communications officer and CMS custodian. Out of wardroom heavy with JLs, I was the only one outside the engineering department that did that. So I decided to go straight to department head school rather than a second division officer tour or a shore tour, because I was trying to make up for lost time. I got commissioned at almost a 10-year point, and I wasn't going to make CNO if I didn't get moving in a hurry. So I would have been happy to be CEO of my own ship. But so what I did was I went to department head school as a JG, and then I'm going to answer your question, but I just want to set it up for you. So by December of 1988, I'm reporting to an FFG as a frock lieutenant, the junior department head in the entire Atlantic Fleet. And I'm on a ship out of Mayport, Florida, and I'm the only Black officer on the ship. And I have no Blacks in my department above the rank of B5. And I have only one chief on the ship who is a minority, and that was the Black Command Master Chief. So that sets up what was happening in 1988. So in 1987, the Navy had about 50 discrimination complaints. They substantiated 6% of those, which was about 4, I forget which. In 1987, they had roughly 1988, they had roughly 100 discrimination complaints, and they substantiated 3% of them, which is essentially the same number. Now, in 1988, this is what's important. In 1988, the Chief of Naval Operations reported in the New York Times reported that they had done a study and found that there was widespread bias and discrimination against Blacks in the Navy, and they were concerned about it. They did this, CNO study. That was in June. Then again in October, they came out with another study that said there was widespread bias against Blacks in the military and promotion in all other areas. And this study had 73 recommendations on how they were going to address that. So the study's never been released to the public, unlike the Task Force One Navy study that was released, which I have some thoughts on as well. But so 87, 50 complaints, 6% substantiated. 88, 100 complaints, 3% substantiated. And in 1989, the year after the CNO said there was widespread bias and discrimination against Blacks in the Navy, officer and enlisted, they had 156 complaints and 0 were substantiated. So the trend, the number of complaints is going up, but the substantiation rate is going down. I was a chief engineer in the Persian Gulf, standing tactical action officer watch. I could have filed a discrimination complaint on average about every 3 weeks. I had, before I left to go to the Persian Gulf, I had a supply officer who was refusing to order my critical parts. He was delaying them, he was canceling them, making me resubmit my requisitions and whatnot. And we had just had an explosion at sea in my engine room, damaged the reduction gear, destroyed the exhaust plenum, one alpha gas turbine engine had caught fire and was burning. I put it out myself, breaking protocol, because I was afraid it was going to cause a bigger explosion, me and 2 other sailors. So I'm under a tremendous amount of stress trying to fix that, $1 million worth of repairs. Plus I had a shaft seal, prototype shaft seal being installed because I convinced the Navy to replace the one we had because it kept failing. I didn't want my ship to sink in the middle of the Persian Gulf. That would reflect poorly on me as a chief engineer. So I couldn't get anyone to help me. I'm the only Black officer on the ship. I'm telling the other department heads, I'm telling the CO and the XO, and the other department heads ignored me. And the CO and the XO are telling me to work it out with the supply officer. Well, the supply officer and the captain both were from Texas. So they were buddies. Finally, I decided I was going to create this spreadsheet that showed exactly what was happening. You couldn't see it just looking at the supply system. So I had to stay up all night with my supply petty officer, creating this spreadsheet. I took my 25 most critical parts and I broke it down into segments. It showed what happened at each step along the process. And when I was done about 6 o'clock that morning, I was dumbfounded at how systematic this discrimination was. And I didn't even understand it until I could show it, look at it on paper. So I went in when the captain came in that morning and I showed him that spreadsheet. And I told him, I said, if you don't help me, this ship is not going to deploy on time. If this ship doesn't deploy on time, you're going to have to explain that to someone. And you're not going to blame me because I've been telling you for weeks now that I need help and you won't help. I said, I can't file CAS reps. I can't order these parts and I'm getting further and further behind. So if you don't help me, you need to understand that I'm going to use this spreadsheet to explain to your ISIC and anybody else who comes down and investigates why the ship can't get on time, that you were ignoring me when I was telling you what was happening. Well, he calls the supply officer up and I give the supply officer a copy of this spreadsheet and he says, what's this? I've never seen this before. I said, that's because I was up all night creating. Well, after he couldn't explain why he was canceling parts he needed to fix his own equipment, much less my critical parts, Captain yelled at him and screamed at him, and he went down and immediately started ordering all my parts, which meant I was going to be there all day and all night filing all these CAS reps and all this other stuff. So I increased my workload, but I was able to get all the stuff done that I needed to do. Now, the captain liked that report so much, he told me to teach all the other department heads how to do it because he wanted one from each of us every day. So now we all have an additional workload because the Black guy was being discriminated against and nobody would help. So guess who's the least popular department head on that ship? Well, none of them were willing to speak up. Now my hair was coming out in clumps. I was tasting bile all the time. I was literally falling apart on the inside because of the amount of stress I was under, but nobody cared. My mental health was of no concern to anybody until I pointed out that this is going to impact you as well as me, and I'm not going to be the scapegoat here. So that was what happened before we deployed. And then once we got on the deployment, we're out in the middle of the ocean. There's nobody there. I can't quit. I can't go home. So I was having to battle disrespect, disobeying lawful orders. You know, I mean, you name it. I had a lieutenant from South Carolina punch me in the stomach as I was walking through the wardroom one day after spending a few weeks threatening to whip my ass. And I ignored him because I knew that if he laid his hands on me, one of us was going to get hurt, and I didn't intend for it to be me. So I just ignored him. Finally, after a chief had disobeyed an order that I gave him, and I put him on report for disobeying a lawful order and disrespect towards the commissioned officer. Well, the command, they didn't even take him to Exos mats. They told me to work it out with his department head. Now you can imagine what that does to my credibility as a tactical action officer with weapons release authority when he comes into that space and completely ignores me. So you can imagine what impact that was having on how I saw myself in that environment and how others saw me. Well, when they didn't do what they needed to do, that emboldened this other lieutenant from South Carolina who had been threatening me after he pretended to be my friend. I played that game in high school. And after I, whipped 3 or 4 asses, they finally figured out that I didn't play by the rules. So what happened was I punched him. He punched me and I punched him back. He jumps up and says, "We're the only 2 people in the wardroom, so there are no witnesses." So he says, "You're fucking crazy." And I looked at him. Okay, all right, what's next? So he repeats it, "What's wrong with you? You're crazy," after assaulting me. So I said, "Look, you hit me, I hit you back. What's the problem?" I'm waiting. I'm saying, we're either going to finish this or you're going to get out of here and leave me alone. Never had any more problems with him. But that's the kind of, everything from, the only reason you're an officer is because of affirmative action to physical assault. Those psychological events have a long-term impact on you, which I did not understand the extent of until 20 years after I retired. So having completed that tour, barely survived. It was an 18-month tour, and I was in it for 22 months because the guy that came to relieve me flunked the TAO exam in department head school and had to start all over again. So I wound up doing an additional 4 months of his tour. Did not have a very good assist visit toward the end, and my skipper dinged me on my fitness report on the way out the door. Although we passed all our inspections, we had never had any casualties. We had performed, won the battle lead, passed our OPI. We did everything right. I'll tell you how bad the assist visit was. The captain announced on the day that the assist team arrived that as far as he was concerned, he had the best engineering department in the entire Mayport Basin. I had given him plenty of reasons to believe that, but the mobile training team was a bunch of good old boys, and they thought, okay, we're going to have some fun with this. We had 2 casualties that left us C4 unable to get underway the weekend before we had this assist visit. All my guys had worked around the clock for 2 days trying to get our spaces put back together. One of the casualties was our shaft propulsion system, which had been contaminated with seawater. So I needed divers, I needed flushing, I needed like a 3-day evolution to fix it, 3 or 4 days. So we weren't getting underway. And then I had a fuel leak in the fuel line in one of my diesel enclosures. So I had to rip apart all that stuff. Could not practice my safety checks. So by the time the team comes aboard Monday morning, my crew is exhausted and we're not ready to do, we can't get underway and we're not ready to do those safety checks smartly because we've been working around the clock to try to fix the ship. Well, I'll tell you how bad it was. They looked at my heat stress program and I hadn't had a visit in 18 months. You're supposed to have one every 6 months. But because of our schedule and the casualties and whatnot, we were behind 18 months in visits. And one at the very beginning of my career, or one of my tour, and one at the very end of my tour. Chief engineer doesn't have time to do everything he's required to do on a daily basis. That was told to us by a captain at the engineering school. He said, you're going to have to decide every day what you don't do. And I didn't believe him when he said it, but I believe it now. But anyway, they looked back 6 months in my heat stress program and saw no problems. So they went back 11 and a half months and found one time where I had not done the required heat stress survey when my temperature in the space was above 100 degrees, and they unset my entire program. So I had been perfect 99.9999% of the time. And because I missed one time, and that was probably while I was standing watch in combat as tactical action officer, they unset my entire program. So that gives you an idea how brutal this thing was. Normally, they would not have even gone back that far because we would have gotten underway on that first day. Because we couldn't get underway, they just spent time just looking at all these administrative programs, trying to find something. So I was one of the few Black engineers, one of the few Black officers in Mayport at the time. I saw several Black officers quit and just throw in the towel because they just couldn't take it. I almost did that a few weeks before we deployed because of all of the things that were coming at me, the hostility, the lack of support, the suspicion. I almost did that, but I decided I'm going to tough it out. And I'm glad I did. But it was probably the most professionally taxing period of my entire military career. So having survived that tour, I went to be XO of a Navy hydrofoil down in Key West. And that was a much better tour because I'd gotten a lot smarter and a lot tougher in the 4 years that I'd been an officer before that. Now, I was the junior department head, junior XO in the entire Atlantic Fleet. I went from being the junior department head in the entire Atlantic Fleet to being the junior XO in the Surface Navy. So all the other XOs were lieutenant commanders, and I was this, wet behind the ears lieutenant. But I had been a first-class yeoman. I'd been an equal opportunity program specialist. I'd been a leadership instructor. I had a lot of experience under my belt. So I excelled in that job under two different COs. The second one I called the Prince of Darkness because he was something of a toxic leader. But, that's all in the book. But survived that tour. And then I went to what was supposed to be a safety officer billet in Mayport, Florida. I went back to Mayport, and I was going to essentially a rest period because I was going to a job that was brand new. It had been created because of all the safety mishaps they were having in the Navy at the time. And I was to get up a safety program and to inspect the ships in the squadron for safety related issues and to teach them, how to operate more safely. Well, a couple months into that job, my chief of staff calls me into his office and says, Keith, I want you to take over the training department. And I said, no, thank you. I said, I just enrolled in a master's degree program. That's going to take a lot of my time. And I'm not interested in taking the most difficult job on the staff, which everyone knew was true. And he said, well, Keith, you understand how this works. If you don't volunteer, you're going to wind up with it anyway. So I said, well, Captain, can I go home and sleep on it? He said, sure. So I came in the next morning and volunteered, as everyone knew that I would. Turned out to be the best job I ever had because I had great support. I had very senior captains, my Commodore, and I was able to do a lot of important things, innovative things. We built a war wagon from scratch, saving the Navy a tremendous amount of money, and we could use it whenever we wanted instead of having to schedule it because I controlled it. I combined a lot of finances. I took over port control for some scheduling for training for ships getting ready to go out at sea because on deployment, because we had ships, one would call up and cancel training for another ship and then call right back and schedule that training for themselves. So I took over control of all that. I had to fight with the CO of the fleet training group because nobody likes to give up, power and authority. But eventually I convinced them to let me try it. And then after a few weeks of that, they called up and said, we want you to take over these courses as well. So having done all of that, I had completed 4 back-to-back sea tours, 3 on ships and 1 as a float staff department head. So 3 of my sea tours were as a department head. And I got a call from the flag detail that said, we want you to come to DC and be a flag aide. And I knew that was important. And I knew they don't just call you out of the blue, but I had concerns because I couldn't shave every day. And what I told them was, I have razor bumps really bad when I shave. I said, I use a depilatory powder, but I can only use it every 3 days because it's so harsh. I said, so I don't want to go to work for some guy that doesn't understand that and have him think that I'm reflecting negatively on him and have him, harm my career or cause him a problem. So if you can accept that and understand that, I'm happy to go do that, but I don't want to go work for the wrong guy with a problem that I've told you about, and then you send me into this buzzsaw. So they didn't call me back. So apparently my performance was completely nullified by the fact that I couldn't shave every day.
But
That's gotten better.
Keith, I want to talk about this for a second because even today, I mean, when it comes to the issue of shaving and beards in the military, Black people, Black men have this issue with shaving, right? I mean, I had a friend that I served with that when the Navy changed their policy to where you can no longer have a permanent no shave chit. I mean, he showed up the first week and his face just looked awful. I mean, it looked painful. It looked like, bumps everywhere. You could tell that it physically hurt him to shave. And thankfully, in my chain of command, they were good, saying like, listen, we don't care what the policy is. Just keep it clean, but don't don't shave every single day. You're hurting yourself. But there's a part of me that feels like part of that is setting up minority groups for failure, knowing that there are certain people in the military that physically cannot shave every single day and are not given opportunities because of it, which is kind of wild to me. So it's interesting that you bring that up, that you didn't get a certain position because of this. You can't shave every single day.
Right. And my first 10 years in the Navy, I wore a beard because I came in when beards were authorized. Admiral Zumwalt saw that that was a problem. And he's like, what is the big deal? Let sailors had beards for centuries, you know? So, and it was fine. I mean, there were just as many white guys with beards as there were black guys, probably more because there were more white guys than there were black guys. 60% of black sailors have that condition. When I went through boot camp, I suffered through that for 4 months. And then when I went to officer candidate school, that's about when the policy changed, 83, 84. And I tried to shave, I had to shave, and then I needed to shave for an inspection. I couldn't put a razor on that mess, so I tried to use a depilatory powder, and I had all these holes in my face. And what I wound up doing was burning the skin off of my face on both my cheeks and my chin and my neck. So I had these scabs on all over my face. When I went to the dermatologist, he took one look at my face and he said, "No more shaving for you." I mean, he was disgusted that I had to do that to myself to get them to see what this was like. And my father had the same problem. He was a bosun mate. He was a paratrooper in Korea. He had a two-tone face. Everywhere he shaved was a very dark band across his face from the scar tissue from decades of shaving. Most people, black men, when they get out of the military, the ones that suffer from the condition immediately grow a beard. I see a lot of retired senior military people, white and black, that are sporting beards because it's just easier for them and it's less harsh on their face. So yeah, it's still an ongoing problem. I'm sort of shocked that you're starting to see sailors now in pictures that have, you know, facial hair because they have no shave chit. But the Air Force did a study that shows that a person, service member that has a no shave chit promotes on average about 6 months behind his contemporaries, and he has lower evaluation. Well, you stretch that out over a lifetime of a career, and you're 4 years or 6 years maybe behind your contemporaries because you can't shave every day. That has an impact on how much money you earn in retirement. It has an impact on your quality of life as you're serving, all because of something that is beyond your control.
And did you get any kind of compensation when you got out of the military as far as VA, from a standpoint from having to go through that pain and suffering physically from shaving?
Because of my last year in the Navy, I wanted nothing to do with the VA, nothing to do with the military, nothing to do with any of that because of what I went through my last year. So in answer to your question, no, I didn't even go to the VA to enroll until 20 years after I retired. And the only reason I did it is because I had a buddy of mine call me after he read my book. And he was the only black officer I served with on a ship. We were together. He came in on the tail end of my first tour on a ship, and I mentored him a little bit. But he told me, he said, "Keith," he says, "I've been getting disability for years." He said, "You need to file a claim. You deserve compensation for what you went through." He said, "Your claim will be approved." And he had never told me in all those years that he had filed a claim. And he went into the reserves because he had some issues while he was on active duty. But he filed a claim and he had been getting compensation for years. I'll tell you what happened to me. It was so difficult for me reliving all those experiences that I'd had in the military that when I self-published my book, I had to drink a bunch of alcohol to get through it because I was self-medicated. But what I did was when I hit send on that button to have that manuscript self-published, I sat down, I picked up a pistol, and I sat there for about 30 minutes because I knew this was going to piss a lot of people off because I named names. I laid out some dirty laundry that the Navy would prefer the public don't know, which is why it's hidden from the public right now. And I knew that people might come after me. And I thought about my father. I looked at that pistol and I looked at, what I'd done. And I just said, you know what? I'm going to tough this out. I'm not going to take myself off this planet because I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just telling the truth. And I have had so many people reach out to me and tell me how much the book has helped them and saved them. Every week I get calls from people asking for my advice and help. And the first thing I tell them is make sure that you have documented in your service record what this has done to you psychologically, physically, and emotionally. You need to get a diagnosis. I had a diagnosis of anxiety and depression, but I wanted nothing to do with the military. And I got it from a civilian practitioner because I was thinking about killing the guy that was tormenting me. He was intentionally overloading me and under-resourcing me, and then telling people he was going to fire me and et cetera, giving me work to do. I was the telephone officer. I ran a 6,000 phone line telephone system, and I couldn't get a government cell phone because the comptroller, every time I would order one, he would intercept it and give it to somebody else and tell me he'd order me another one. So this guy was a former enlisted Marine. It's a long, complicated story. It's all in the book, the first book. But I was at the point where I was thinking homicidal thoughts in dealing with these people. I wasn't going to take myself off the planet. I fully understand how workplace violence develops because I went to a mental health practitioner. My sister told me, you need to go talk to somebody. Here's a lady I want you to talk to, because I had been sitting in a meeting and my chest muscles started to quiver uncontrollably. You could see it through my shirt, right over my heart. And I nudged my number two, who was a civilian, and I said, look at this. And he immediately said, sir, we've got to get you to the ER. And I said, I'm not in any pain. He said, sir, you're having a heart attack. We've got to get you to the ER. And I said, I'm not going to die in an ambulance. I'm going to walk across the grass over to the branch clinic and let them take a look at me. If I'm going to die, I'm going to die on green grass. So I walked in there and they took one look at me and what was happening with my chest. And they rushed me back in a room in a wheelchair, hooked me up to all of this equipment. And then they said, sir, there's nothing wrong with your heart. And they said, are you under any stress? And I laughed, and my number two looked at them like, you have no idea. So I went to the mental health practitioner, and she diagnosed me with anxiety and depression, chronic depression, dysthymia. Considering what I was going through, it should have been, it should have been PTSD. Didn't trust anybody, was having nightmares, not sleeping, et cetera, et cetera. So to make a long story short, no, I didn't want anything to do with the VA until my buddy called me after he read my book and said, you need to file a claim. Well, I called the VA hotline and I explained to them what I had gone through and, et cetera, and that I'd written a book and I had a diagnosis from, 20 years before. And the counselor said, Mr. Green, he says, you have multiple avenues for a claim. He says, I believe you have a claim for unemployability. After I left the Navy, I never had another job. Every time I would go to fill out an application or file one online, my hands would start to sweat. I would get sick to my stomach because I could not envision myself in that environment again, where if I dealt with somebody like that again, somebody was going to get hurt because I could not physically stomach the idea of putting myself in that environment again. Fortunately, I had acquired some real estate, bought some real estate, and I was able to, buy and sell and refinance real estate for a good long while. And then by the time after I filed my claim, I was able to draw Social Security and then get my VA benefits. But for 20 years, when I filed my claim, I had a buddy who was a Navy JAG officer, a Navy captain. We served together as SWOs on my first ship. And I got him off to the right foot. And then we served again on the same base when I worked for an admiral. And he was on the same base working in the legal office. He wrote a buddy letter for me. And in that letter, it said, reading Keith's book, I lost track of the number of the violations of the UCMJ that were committed against him. And this is a JAG officer. So my claim got approved immediately, and I got awarded 70% disability. When I told the VA person, I said, what happens if I try to go back and get compensation for all the years that I didn't file? He said, you can't do it. He said, don't even think about it. So I calculated it up, and there's about $350,000 that I'd left on the table because I was afraid to go to the VA, and I didn't trust the VA, and I was afraid, I wasn't even aware that you could file for anxiety and depression. I didn't know that was even a category.
So they only gave you 70% out of everything?
Yeah, they only gave me 70%.
That's
And
interesting because I mean, I'll use myself as an example, right? I got 90%.
yeah,
And not to compare or anything, but I don't feel like what I went through, it, it pales to comparison of what you went through, right? And so this is what I think is broken with the VA system, especially when it comes to mental health related things, and especially for these veterans that served a while ago, right? That you've been harboring this stuff for years. In my mind, that deserves more compensation because you've shown this pattern of you can't work. You've been harboring this stuff. It's almost worse when you hold on to it for so much longer. And this is just personal opinion, so let me know if I'm going on the wrong track here. But yeah, and then on top of that, dealing with speaking out against the military, and that, I think there's always not necessarily a fear of retaliation, but it's always kind of in the back of our minds, right? Those of us that speak out against something, knowing that the government, anyone could retaliate and no one would blink an eye, unless, circumstances lined up just right. And so, all these things that you're dealing with, and it just kind of blows my mind that they only gave you 70% compensation for that, which better than nothing, right? But still, I mean, to me, you deserved more. So I just had to say that.
I know people that are receiving 100% who had far fewer problems and issues than I did and who filed immediately. What I've found is that people that are getting compensation don't like to talk about it, which means that if they're not sharing their story, then other people. I took a white guy from Alabama who had served in the Navy for 10 years. And I said, Jesse, I told him, I said, you need to file a claim. You're entitled to compensation. And I took him down to the VA, and he wound up getting some compensation for some issues that he had. But so many people don't do it. And he had been retired. He had been out of the service. He only served 10 years, and he'd been out for a long time. So it is difficult to get people to talk about this stuff because there's a certain stigma. I want to talk to you about retaliation. In my last tour, I filed a 5-page discrimination complaint against that CO that was abusing me. And when I asked him, I said, I want to know why this is happening to me. I said, I've been a team player everywhere I've served, and I have never had these kind of problems. I want to know why this is happening to me. And I had gotten quite emotional because it was, it had been going on for like 9 months. And he looked at me with a smirk and he said, well, do you feel like a second-class citizen? So in other words, he's telling me, I'm doing this to you because you're Black and I can do it and nothing's going to happen. Well, when I filed that 138 complaint against him, he had 2 days to respond. 10 days later, he had not responded to my complaint because it was supposed to go to the base admiral, who had also come after me because I refused to do what he asked me to do. And then he had the Naval Audit Service come in and do a 2-week audit on my department, trying to get me fired. Well, they backed me instead of him. So I'm taking it from all sides, having trouble in my marriage. So it was at home, it was in my command, it was outside my command. It was just a whole confluence of things. So I was under a tremendous amount of pressure. So, and then the CNO committed suicide 5 days after I filed my complaint. So that was a tremendous shock to the entire Navy. So I didn't want any Navy to have any more bad press. So I just told him and said, you'll give me basket leave starting in January. I'm going to retire on the 1st. Use up all my leave, basket leave. And I did. So I just licked my wounds for 20 years trying to make sense of this. The organization that I thought would protect me after having given them my entire adult life to that point, turned their back on me when I needed the help the most. And that is not an uncommon story. I'm helping people right now that are living that as we speak. So if you want to talk about retaliation, retaliation is real, and it doesn't matter how far you've been. If you start speaking out, someone can come after you. Right after the January 6th insurrection, I was on edge because I saw what had happened, and I knew that the reason that it happened is because the lie was told that Black people voted in all these places illegally and caused President Trump to lose the election. He specifically targeted Black and Hispanic areas. So the storyline was that the election was stolen. But the focus, the razor focus of it was Black people in Georgia and Arizona and Pittsburgh and other places like that had voted illegally, Chicago. So at the very root of it, it was a racist allegation. So when I saw what had happened on this January 6th, I was on edge because I figured there's going to be bloodshed. But in the meantime, I had gone in a few days after that to get a biopsy because I'd had an abnormal PSA on my prostate 6 months earlier. And I got another abnormal PSA. And the doctor had told me, if your PSA is still abnormal, we will likely do another biopsy. I made the mistake the first time of giving him a flyer from the book that I wrote. And when I saw his face wrinkle up just from the title, Black Officer, White Navy, I knew I was in trouble. I didn't know how, but I knew I was in trouble. So when I walked in to have the biopsy, I'm laying down on the table, and this guy walks in, and he says, "Mr. Green, why are you here?" Which was an odd question from the doctor getting ready to do a procedure. And I said, "Well, because you said you wanted me to have this follow-up biopsy." He says, "No, I didn't. I didn't know anything about this until just a few minutes ago." Now, I've asked everyone I've told this story to tells me that that's the biggest crock of shit they've ever heard. No one can just call up their doctor's office and schedule a biopsy without getting the permission of the doctor or someone in the office. So I said, "No, I called your office. I spoke with the person that answered the phone. She said, I said, I haven't had any follow-up on this. I need to know what the next step is." She said, "Hold on a minute." She goes and talks to the doctor, spends about 5 minutes. She comes back and tells me, "He wants to schedule you for a biopsy. Can we schedule you?" And I said, "Yes." So I had no idea that there was a problem other than the fact they didn't have my medication ready for, at the pharmacy. So I went to their office and I said, they didn't have my medication. And they said, "Oh, sometimes they forget to do it if you don't pick it up, on time." I said, "Well, I was told to pick it up 2 hours before the procedure," and that's when I was there. So that gave me an indication something might be wrong. But it turns out what he forgot to do was when he told her to schedule that. They scheduled in their computer, but he didn't put it in his own notes. So he didn't have that information there. That's not my fault that they didn't have their act together. So when he said no, when I explained to him what had happened, he said, "No, you did this yourself. You did this on your own. You've circumvented the system." So I'm ready to come up off the table because I've got an angry man about to insert something into my rectum and punch holes in me. So I was very concerned about what was about to happen. So then he gives me this lecture on how to conduct myself as a patient. And I'm sitting there, my mind is swimming, trying to figure out why is this happening? And should I stop here and back away? Because I don't know how much damage he could do because he's angry. And this was retaliation. So he says, "Do you want me to conduct this procedure?" And I said, "Yes. But when this is over, I want you to get to the bottom of this." And from that moment until the time he called me to tell me that I had prostate cancer, I never talked to him. He called me 2 or 3 days later. In the meantime, I filed a complaint immediately with Patient Affairs. And that was on a Friday. I took it in that Tuesday because the Monday was a holiday. And I handed it to them. I said, "I want you to read this. Tell me who this needs to go to. I've addressed it to the CO, but I want this dealt with." Well, 2 days after that, I get a phone call from Patient Affairs or from the Patient Affairs rep at the urology clinic saying, "What can we do to make you feel better?" I said, "You can explain to me why this doctor attacked me and accused me of stuff I hadn't done." So I said, "I want a written response. I want to know why this happened." I didn't hear anything from them. And then he calls me up, says, "Mr. Green, you have prostate cancer. This isn't going to kill you, but you need to look at, we think you should be on the watch and wait program. But because you're not happy with me, find yourself another doctor. Ask for someone other than me." So not only has he accused me of something I haven't done, but then he tells me he doesn't want to be my doctor anymore because I've accused him of mistreating me. Well, when I went in to see his boss tells me, "Well, your complaint is just hearsay." And I said, "Well, the witness that heard him call me a liar out in the waiting area, and the witness who saw what he did in the room, one is sitting right here, the other is right outside your door." He said, "Well, I haven't had time to talk to them." Well, that's not my problem. If he doesn't know the difference between direct firsthand testimony and hearsay, he's got no business conducting an investigation or questioning me about what had happened. So I waited a few days and didn't hear anything more. So I filed an IG complaint. I'm hot under the collar like you can't believe, because these people are trying to destroy my reputation because they don't like what I'm writing about my experience in the military with facing the same kind of issues. I can't tell you how much stress I was under because of this, because I was worried that something was going to come back on me, some sort of accusation on something that I had done that I had not done. So I filed an IG complaint, and they assigned a captain in Jacksonville, the same area, to investigate. Well, that captain never talked to me. How do you conduct an investigation of an IG complaint and you don't talk to the person that filed the complaint? But it turns out they had a safety stand down because they had problems with their front office and their procedures. So because of my complaint, they had a safety stand down, identified all these problems that they had. They weren't following their own procedures, but no one addressed the doctor's behavior towards me. I said, this captain called me and I said, she told me they'd had a safety stand down, they'd done this, they'd done that. I said, ma'am, I said, I don't care about all that. I said, I want to know why this happened to me. Why was I accused of something I had not done? This has had a negative impact on my mental health. I was getting counseling from the VA. The counselor has extended my counseling because he said, you were doing so well and this has set you back, a lot. I said, I want to know why this happened to me. I said, I'm never setting foot in that place again, but I want to know why this happened to me. And she said, we may never know why this happened to you. Now, you're his direct commanding officer, and you're going to tell me you can't find out why I was mistreated by someone under your responsibility. And I said, ma'am, I said, I've conducted investigation of airplane crashes. I've conducted investigation of all sorts of things. I said, I can find out why this happened to me if you give me 15 minutes looking at the paperwork and talking to people. I said, I want a written statement saying that I have done nothing wrong. Well, 12 days later, I still didn't have it, so I filed a TRICARE grievance. And I overnighted it to wherever they are out in the Midwest. The very next day, they got it that morning. The very next afternoon, there was a letter in my mailbox saying that I had done nothing wrong, the problem was on their end, and that they had, I had done nothing wrong. Well, that letter was backdated by about 10 days because the only way that letter could have gotten in my mailbox was if they drove it there and put it in my mailbox and then backdated it from, like 10 days before, from the day that I had the conversation with. I used to be a yeoman. I understand how the admin office works. So after that, I filed a FOIA request. I want to know what was said about me to cause you to have the safety stand down, and what was said about me to cause me to be accused of having done something that I didn't do. You're saying in writing that I didn't do anything wrong, but you won't tell me what was said about me. So character assassination is one of the ways people retaliate against me. So I filed that request in April of 2021. Now the event happened in January. Now this is April. I just found out last week that the investigation had been complete because I queried them on it. And they said, well, we have to, you're in the queue. We have to do this and do that. We're sorry, but we don't know when we're going to get to it. And I said 18 months. I would submit that 18 months is more than enough time to have waited to find out why this happened to me, particularly since the people who know are a 20-minute drive from my house, and that's where all the records are. Well, a couple of days after that, it turns out, this was a few days after I published the article about making racist behavior a UCMJ offense. So all of a sudden, I get an email saying, hey, we're going to expedite this. We should have an answer to you by the 10th of November. Then I get a follow-on email saying that investigation has been complete with redactions, just need it signed off by my supervisor, and I hope to get it to you by the 10th. Well, today is what, 15th? I still have not received anything. So something is going on, but I know a cover-up when I see one. I should not have to work this hard to clear my name when I haven't tell me in writing that I haven't done anything wrong, but I'm worried about some sort of repercussions or blowback, which is having an impact on my mental health. Obviously, I know what can happen because it's already happened. I've read a lot of case studies. I've read a lot of stuff where people have been targeted and blamed and whatnot. So these are the kind of things that the Vietnam era veterans are dealing with, but they don't have the resources and the wherewithal that I have. I'll give you a statistic. There were thousands of discrimination complaints filed in Vietnam in the theater during the Vietnam War. They sent over, DOD sent over these special teams, and they reviewed all these complaints that had been filed. Only 4 complaints were found to be where race was a factor, but none of them were identified as having been racist behavior. So not one Vietnam serviceman had his complaint of racism substantiated. And I was shocked when I read that. And I read it in a book called Fighting on Two Fronts by George Westheider. He's dead now, but he wrote a book about what it was like for those servicemen. And there are so few books about the post-Vietnam era, and not one Black serviceman wrote about what his experiences were like in the Vietnam era. And there's like 4 books that were written, back then, and 2 of those were written by people that didn't serve, and they were novels. So there's a big hole in the literature where all of these stories ought to be, which will show that I'm not just some disgruntled. I've been called, an extremist. I've been called a radical. I've been called communist, Marxist, all this other stuff. But nobody has said that what you have said is not true. So they want to attack me rather than the information that I'm putting out there. And there are thousands of people suffering right now. I watched a commander say that his commanding officer called him a wetback, and that they were throwing racial slurs around in his command. He filed a complaint and he gets punished. He says, I know that I'm never going to have command. I know I've ruined my career, but I wanted you to know that this stuff is still happening. And he said, he was on a panel. And then the very next day, he said, the only reason I'm here, this was in a group of 350 people, including several flag officers and some representatives from Congress and some senior executive service personnel. He says, the only reason I'm here is to say F you to that guy that screwed me over. And not one person in authority approached him to say, what happened to you? How can we help? Because they don't want those stories out there. But I told him, I said, you need to talk to someone in the mental health arena. You need to have this documented in your record. You need to immediately apply for compensation when you retire, because you will be thinking about this 20, 30 years after you're gone. Don't do what I did. I use myself as a cautionary tale. Don't do what I did. You get out there and you get compensation and you document your story. And that way, if we build enough of documented stories, they can't just say, well, that's a one-off, or that was particular to that commander individual. If a person starts discriminating when they're an E3 or an E4 and they're never held accountable, it's never documented, or when they're a JG or a lieutenant, by the time they're a captain, they feel bulletproof.
Exactly.
The captain who set me on this path was from Alabama. He graduated from college in 1971, a couple of years after Martin Luther King was shot. When I reported to my first shore duty, he took one look at me and decided, because I had a black face, I couldn't do the department head job that I'd been ordered in there to do. And he assigned me to relieve an ensign that had 2 part-time subordinates and no job. Her only job was to implement the total quality leadership program. So that one decision, before I could even check in and give him my records, the XO pulled me back and says, this is going to be your new office. You're going to be taking over this job. I said, XO, what happened? I said, I just spoke to my sponsor 30 minutes ago. I said, he didn't indicate that there was a problem. Why the change? He wouldn't look at me. He said, well, the captain just thinks you'd be better suited for this job. That's when I went down to the captain's office and pulled his biography and saw his background. He had served on the USS Spruance, where 6 years before, a black officer had run that ship aground down in Andros Island, down in the Bahamas, and he viewed me as a threat to his career. So rather than talk to me or look at my record or anything, he just made a decision based on the color of my skin that I couldn't do the job I'd been ordered in there to do. Now, a few weeks later, when he calls me in to finally have his sit down, welcome aboard thing, normally it happens right away. I'm the senior officer in that command other than the XO. Normally it happens right away. But when he called me in, he asked me, after giving me his little fatherly speech, he asked me if I thought about going to department head school. And I was dumbfounded. I said, sir, excuse me? And he says, have you thought about going to department head school? And I looked at him, I said, Captain, I said, this is my 4th department head tour. I said, I was chief engineer on a FFG. I was XO on a hydrofoil. I was the import training officer at Desron 8. Why would you think I had not been to department school? Didn't you look at my record? And he's looking at me like I've got horns coming out of my head because no, he had not looked at my service record. So his every move was based on the color of my skin and nothing else. Once he realized who I was, he must have made some phone calls and whatnot, because a few days later, he announces at a staff meeting that he's decided to use this superstar surface warfare officer to run the telephone office, which was the job I'd been ordered in there to take in the first place. But not only that, I've decided I'm also going to give him the facilities department, which is a completely separate other department, the engineering stuff. So I go from being too incompetent to run one department to now being tasked to run two, but he's only going to give me one paycheck. And he's not going to support me with the comptroller, who is not, ordering stuff I needed. I needed some cabinets for the first office. And I went to the comptroller and said, I need these cabinets. He said, put in a requisition. I put in the requisition and nothing happened. So I went out to a thrift store and bought all these cabinets out of pocket and took them in my pickup truck. I'm used to getting around these sorts of obstacles because I've been doing it for 20 years. But that set the tone. He wouldn't order me a phone. He wouldn't order my parts. He wouldn't order surveys and stuff that I needed. So it was an ongoing battle for almost a year before I finally filed my complaint.
So Keith, there's a few things that I want to unpack here. The first, talking about the gaps in documentation when it comes to really obviously when we're talking about like a Vietnam era, World War II era, I mean, anything military, there's going to be more gaps because people just, they get silenced one time and they're afraid to speak out ever again. And I see it even in the recent years. I mean, and not even just talking about Black people. I've had friends that, are Mexican, and, when the whole wall thing came about, that was a huge thing when it came to really bringing out the racist individuals in the military. And so, there's a huge gap in education and knowledge. I think in the most recent years, we're starting to learn more about Black history and what truly happened in Black history. And now understanding that, these were the ways that Black people have been undermined throughout history in general. And then when we look at the military, I mean, you're really putting Black people under a microscope in the military, just like Black people were put under a microscope in the school systems and the universities back in this time when the US was going through such a massive quote unquote transformation, as they were trying to integrate Black people more into society. But even today, I mean, we still see these disparities happening, but I think that it's more on a microaggression level when we're talking about day-to-day stuff, and that's harder to prove. So when we talk about hearsay, and we talk about, hey, you can't prove this, I think that's where a lot of people feel silenced, because when you say something like, hey, I can't shave my face and this is really affecting me, I'm not trying to be belligerent, I'm not trying to not be compliant, but this is damaging me in this way that it's hard for me to do my job. Or let's talk about the hair thing. I mean, Black women, what was it, 2-3 years ago, just now started being able to wear their hair in locks in the services, because for the longest time, the military did not understand why Black women had a hard time with their hair as opposed to women of other ethnicities. I can't even just say white women because, we're talking about hair types here, but there's this barrier, this continuous barrier to entry for minorities in the military service. And we continue to see it. And it's so incredibly difficult to prove these things when they are on that microaggression level, or someone's not present, or, we're talking about people coming from different cultures. And this is what was interesting to me, because I'm from Iowa. So yes, there is racism that exists across the country, but I think the people that grow up in the South, where there's been this constant heavy history of racism, they're different from people that grew up in the North, right? And so when you take people, and even coast to coast, you take people from all these different areas of the US and you integrate them all into the military system, and you expect them to all behave a certain way, not everyone can handle that. Not everyone understands that, hey, you probably shouldn't say this to someone because that's racist and offensive. Or, hey, making this comment's not appropriate for the workplace. Because not everyone knows but not everyone's willing to correct their behavior to make it a better place for everyone all around. And so I appreciate that you speak out on these things, because you're right. When people hear stories like this, because there's not that majority story, because so many people are not speaking out, it's easy to label someone like you or I as crazy, as, a communist, as someone who's trying to undermine the government, when no, like, you're just out here trying to make the world a better place for people so that they don't have to experience what you experienced. And so, again, I'm so appreciative that you are speaking out on your experiences, even though, you're still to this day dealing with things. And, you continue to advocate for those people who really aren't comfortable advocating for themselves. So, where can we find your book, Keith?
My book is available on Amazon. The title is Black Officer, White Navy. Now, that book will soon be a collector's item because it's self-published, but I have a contract with University Press of Kentucky to publish a revised edition. It's only going to be half the length of the self-published edition. It will only deal strictly with the Navy stuff. My first book looks like it was written by someone that was doing a lot of drinking with no adult supervision. And that's because it was. Now, the revised edition is going to be professional. It should have pictures, and it will just be a straight chronology of the experiences in the military. So it'll be an easier read, and it won't scare the white people so much. So you can find the book on Amazon, Black Officer, White Navy. I would recommend, if you want to read the unfiltered version, that you get it, because sometime next year, the grown-up version will be out.
Awesome. Well, I'll make sure to link that book in the show notes for anyone who wants to check that out and support you, learn a little bit more about your unabridged version of your story. And, I really hope that a lot of people take advantage of that, because there's so many lessons to be learned from people like you that have been through it. Keith, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on, share your story. And as we wrap up here, I just wanted to ask if there are any last words that you wanted to share with the audience.
Yeah, no matter what you're going through, all you have to do is look forward to surviving the next 15 minutes. If you can make it through the next 15 minutes, then you can make it through the 15 minutes after that. So break stuff down into 15-minute increments. Take 15 minutes and look at the 102 reviews of my book on Amazon, and that will give you an idea of the impact that it has had in the 5 years that it's been out there. So just take 15 minutes to look through that, and then decide whether or not you think the book is worthwhile.
Thank you for taking the time to listen in today. With your support, we are able to increase awareness of the mental health issues affecting service members and veterans today, with the goal of creating positive change. If you got value from this episode, please take 30 seconds to subscribe and share this episode within your own network. Until next time, remember, your story matters, your mental health matters, and your story doesn't end here.